we're going to start the meeting now. We are light on a couple of people this evening, but we're still quorum, so I think 2 of them will be here eventually. I do have apologies for absence. First of all, welcome to the second Hidden and Street Harms Prevention Committee. We were supposed to have this in December, but COVID got in the way, so I couldn't miss it again, so we're holding it now, 17th of January. Apologies for absence. Councillor Abbas has said his apologies. Councillor Anderson is coming. He's stuck in traffic, as is Councillor Quigley. So they'll join us shortly. Right, minutes on item 2 on the agenda. Minutes. Can we approve the minutes as correct?
Yeah, I agree.
Agree?
Yeah.
Okay, items of urgent business. I haven't received any items of urgent business. Is there any items of urgent business?
No.
Thank you, that's item 3. Anyone? Item 4, declarations of interest. Any declarations of interest, anyone?
No.
And here is Councillor Anderson. Thank you. Thank you, Vice Chair. Just opening that, okay? So we come to item 5 on the agenda, unaccompanied asylum seekers introductory report continued from the 2nd November 2021 meeting. And who will be presenting that, Cheryl?
It's Luke from it. Luke from it.
Luke from it. Luke.
Hi all. So I'm going to go through the report that we started to discuss at the last hearing, the last meeting, as you've mentioned. So the report.
We should have all have read the report before we come here. So if you just give a quick overview, and then we'll dive into some questions, if that's all right.
No problem, yeah. So the report goes through some of the definitions around unaccompanied asylum seeking children, some of the processes that the local authority is responsible for when children and young people enter the country unaccompanied. So there's some of definitions around what constitutes an unaccompanied asylum seeking child. Some of the background is discussed in the report in terms of Thurrock's particular circumstances, particularly geographical location, which means that Thurrock is a port of entry for unaccompanied asylum seeking children. This means that we get a number of new arrivals who arrive into the UK and are first picked up and noticed by Thurrock local authority or police or border force, etc. And the initial kind of work around understanding those young people's circumstances, their age and their needs falls to Thurrock professionals. Very often the work that we do with unaccompanied asylum seeking children in Thurrock is short term, and those young people that we initially kind of come across and meet and settle and ensure are safe are then moved on to other local authorities. Part of that process is around assessing the age of unaccompanied asylum seeking children. When they first come into the UK, we undertake what's called a brief inquiry. If there is a question about the validity of their stated age, that can lead on to a more full assessment, which is a Merton compliant age assessment. There are issues around human trafficking with unaccompanied asylum seeking children, and some work between the local authority and police colleagues around reducing the risk of young people coming into the country subsequently being trafficked. There is a particular police operation referred to as Inurse Day, which asks the police in particular to treat young people in line with child protection procedures rather than in line with criminal processes, which is aimed at strengthening the relationship building that we have between professionals and young people coming into the country to avoid them going missing often, and to ask them to build strong relationships with professionals that they can kind of engage with and can keep them safe. A lot of that work relies on our multi-agency working with the police, with border force, with the Home Office and with other local authorities that we transfer young unaccompanied asylum seeking children too. The report mentions other aspects such as the national referral mechanism, which is a database which holds information where there might be a suspicion that a young person is at risk of modern slavery. It also mentions the independent child trafficking guardian, which is a relatively new phenomenon, which is an independent person who works alongside professionals when children first come into the country, and there might be issues around modern slavery or human trafficking. Subsequently, within the report, there's some of the data which is around the numbers of young people we've had that come into Thurrock, and the breakdown in terms of some of the ages, ethnicities, etc. And some information around the number of young people who might go missing, whether that's for a short-term period of time, or we have some unaccompanied asylum seeking children who go missing in the longer term. Further to that, there's some information around the type of placements, whether that be foster placements that children are placed in or semi-independent provision, and some of the costs around those placements. That's a very brief kind of whistle-stop tour of the report. So I'll open the floor to questions.
Thank you, Luke. Much appreciated, and it's a big subject to cover. It's also a very difficult area, which nobody envies you for, and on behalf of the committee, we really appreciate and applaud the hard work you're doing in what is a very, very difficult area of this sort of thing, unaccompanied asylum seekers, and there's so many risks endemic in what's going on here. You know, whether the person, the child, is safe. I'd just like to ask you a question, a couple of questions first before we go to the committee. When you interview these children, what have they been told? What are they expecting from the UK? And do you have any idea why they come to the UK? Because many of them will have travelled all the way across Europe. What's so attractive about the UK that's unattractive in the rest of Europe?
I mean, I think generally our impression is that these children and young people have been on a massive journey that takes many months in some cases, and is fraught with danger in many cases. And the common theme that we find in terms of motivation is that they do that because they don't feel safe in their country of origin. So for various reasons, sometimes to do with religion or sexuality or particular circumstances around their own family, for example. But overwhelmingly, what we see is young people who come into this country because they feel safer. It's interesting actually, because obviously we know that when children make that journey, they're at incredible risk of abuse along the way, exploitation along the way, and in some cases those risks probably aren't known to those children as they set out at the beginning of that journey. But the journey itself is a scary prospect for most of the unaccompanied asylum seeking children that we come across, and yet they feel that it's a less risky prospect than staying in their country of origin.
I just want to clarify that. I understand that they do have harrowing journeys. Do they get an option then when they travel across Europe? Because an awful lot of them get trafficked across Europe, whether they want to sort of drop off in Germany or Poland or Holland or something like that, or is it, oh no, we're trafficking you and you're going to end up in Britain? Do they have a choice? And if they're being told that they come to the UK, what are they being told that the UK that's so special about? Makes us different from all the other European countries they go travel.
It's very difficult to get a sense of that. These children have very individual journeys, and we wouldn't necessarily have a discussion with the child around why did they choose to come to the UK as opposed to another European country, for example. And very often there is a lack of choice, or they might think they've made a choice, but actually, as it turns out, they made a very different choice. So what they set out for at the outset of their journey is not necessarily what happens at the end, and that that can be due to all sorts of variables, including very unscrupulous individuals that kind of take large sums of money from family members, perhaps to offer one thing that turns out not to be the case. So it's not necessarily a conversation about choice along the way so much as survival in many cases.
Okay, thank you. I'll just put it out to the committee now. Councillor and Councillor Canada.
Thank you, Luke. One of the things that I was sparking my interest last time I had the report, and again reading through it again today, was that when these children come over to the UK, they traffic over to the UK, or they make their way to the UK. What do the UK agencies do to investigate the longevity of their stay? So are they aware if they're being funneled off into criminal gangs, or if they've been pre-booked to go to work somewhere, or something like that? Have we got an idea of what the long-term goal is that they've come over here? You may have a gang that is operating some workshop somewhere that these children come over to join. Have we got an idea of that sort of investigation that goes on?
From the local authority point of view, obviously our role is to greet the children, to make sure that we know what their needs are and to keep them safe. We certainly have been involved in cases where children have become known to Thurrock local authority and have gone missing for long periods of time, and then subsequently have come back onto our radar as a result of police investigations, for example, where they might have been one case, for example, where a young person having become known to Thurrock and then gone missing relatively quickly, turned up many months later in Scotland as a result of a police investigation into drugs supply and a drugs factory, etc. So we know that young people are picked off and used and exploited. We wouldn't necessarily know that at the outset, and very often from a children's services point of view, the information that we come to understand is provided by the police as part of ongoing police investigations.
So we've never picked them up working on the local farms or nothing like that? No, not as a general rule. No, I can't think of any specific case where that's happened. Certainly. Thank you, Dave.
Councillor Canada.
Yes. I'm going to ask a question firstly on the strength of what my colleague Councillor just said. I was going to ask for the those ones that went missing. Is quite. I mean, the episode is quite sort of high. 27 missing episodes, and then some of them, like on the page 26, that 7 of them out of, I think, 12 that actually got missing accepted the interview, the return to home interview. But I would really be interested in knowing what were the reasons that they went missing. Is it something that you can tell us from the outcomes of the interviews? I mean, those accepted interviews.
So I think there are lots of different reasons, and some of those missing episodes might be very short term. So that might be a young person who's gone missing for a few hours, one night from placement, and then very quickly come back to placement. And so they might have been talking about, they didn't understand that they were safe in the placement, or they might have been just looking at the local area and trying to understand the local area. Obviously, sometimes we get missing episodes which are much longer in duration, and there's a very specific process around what we refer to as long-term missing. So there might be missing episodes where a young person arrives in Thurrock, is settled in a placement, goes missing, leaves without permission, doesn't tell his carer where he's going, and then very quickly comes back. And there could be lots of reasons for that. They might have, had a disagreement with their carer. They might have not liked what they were having for dinner. Like quite frivolous reasons in some occasions. But where young people kind of go missing in the longer term, that that can be for different reasons. So some young people we know come into the country and they might have had an arrangement to meet somebody. So, they might have had contact numbers, they might already know somebody in the country, they might have been told by somebody who moved them or trafficked them to contact a certain person when they get into the country. They might feel at risk if they don't do that. So it's very individualized in terms of the reasons why young people might go missing, and some of them are quite ordinary, and reasons that our resident children go missing, and some of them are quite specific. So we did have a spate of young people who came into the country from a certain part of the world, and as soon as they arrived in their placement, they would ask, where is Big Ben? And they wanted to visit London and they wanted to see Big Ben, and subsequently many of those children went missing. So we can see patterns sometimes in those kind of cases where there might be a particular community in that area. There might be linked to something more nefarious like a gang or trafficking. So we obviously learn to look for those patterns and use that information when we have new arrivals who might come from the same parts of the world, so that we can kind of take an informed approach to that. But it's very difficult to give kind of patterns in terms of what children say in their return to home interviews.
Chair, my question is actually the 7 accepted the interview, and I would not ask Luke to just assume or give me assumptions of why they might have gone missing, but actually from the interview, were the interview held for the 7 that accepted that interview, and were you able to, I mean, maybe for future, record exactly why some of them are missing? Because it's not really enough information to just tell us, yes, 7 accepted, but I'm hearing you giving assumption of why they might go missing. But if we actually know why they go missing, because we are corporate parent, as the report has indicated, and we do really need to know for the sort of future. So that is what I would like to say. And also I would like you to sort of, I know the line of inquiry that the chair had about why did they come to Britain, but I believe that there are unaccompanied asylum seekers all over, not just Britain. So if research has been done to say, okay, how many goes here or there, but I don't think it's only Britain that we have. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think it's only Britain that the children come into. I mean, in the Europe, you hear they're all over the place, but you can correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I think you're right that young people do seek asylum in other countries, absolutely. I think in terms of the return to home interviews, I understand. I couldn't say right now what the reasons were that those 7 young people went missing, but certainly part of what the return to home interview looks at is the push and pull factors when any child goes missing, whether they're an unaccompanied asylum seeking child or not. So part of the purpose of that interview is to understand what helps children to stay in placement and what motivates children to leave placement. And obviously, we would work to give children opportunities to tell us if they're worried about something particular or if there's something particular that motivated them to go missing, because that's information that we will use to make sure we're meeting their needs as closely as we can moving forward.
Just one more, Chair, if I may, and that is on the money and the budget. Should we accept that the money to care for this as unaccompanied asylum seeker purely from the government and it's not from the social care budget? But do we recoup all this money back into Thurrock? The money that you spent in keeping them is purely from the government and not just as part of the budget for the social care, children's social care.
So we do receive grants towards the cost of those cases that we hold involving unaccompanied asylum seeking children. I think it's fair to say that the grant money that's received from the government doesn't fully cover the cost of the work that's involved to support those children.
Thank you, Jason. Councillor Anderson, I'll come back to you. Councillor Anderson.
Thank you, Chair. I did notice that Janet had her hand up during that passage. I don't know if you wanted to quickly come in before I went, Janet.
It was just really to reiterate what Luke is saying, that yes, we do have young people that go missing. They do have return home interviews. We do record them. We try and get learning from those experiences and what young people are saying. But I suppose I just want to reinforce that the large majority of our unaccompanied asylum seekers are not missing and don't go missing. But we do have, young people develop relationships if they've traveled together and they've developed friendships. When they get to around 17, they may sort of ring up and say, I'm staying out for the night. And that will be recorded as a missing episode because we don't know where they are. But it doesn't mean that they haven't come back later that night or early the next morning. And often, especially when they're around 17 and approaching 18, they're quite clear. I'm going round to my friends. That's where I'm staying. And I'll be back tomorrow. And they generally come back. So the vast majority of our unaccompanied asylum seekers stay in their placements, are in education and doing quite well.
So just quickly to my question, Luke, and you've already sort of touched on it in a couple of your previous answers. That you used the word that I would use, which is pattern. So I understand, as Janet's just said, that most of the unaccompanied asylum seeking children aren't missing, don't go missing for long periods of time. But of those that do go missing for what we would consider a long period of time, do we have we noticed any particular patterns, and how deeply do you look into that? Are they turning up when they eventually do turn up again in particular areas, or doing particular things? And I suppose as well, how good is our communication with other bodies when this arises? Because obviously, if you've got an unaccompanied asylum seeking child that goes missing for a period of months, and as I understand, there's not huge amounts of those. I think it's really important that we try and identify patterns to stop that going ahead in the future.
Yeah, we certainly do recognise patterns in terms of those young people who might be more likely to go missing, particularly if they come from a certain part of the world, I think, as I kind of touched on in a previous answer. In terms of the communication while those young people are missing, so first of all, when they go missing initially, we would follow our robust procedures in the same way that we would for any other missing child. So we would hold a strategy meeting. In that meeting would involve all professionals working with that child. It would involve the relevant police, depending on where the child's placement was situated, and we would use our best endeavours to locate that child as quickly as possible. In some cases where a child stays missing for a long period of time, there would be a number of strategy meetings where the case might be reviewed every few days to see whether there was any new information, any new leads, for social care, the police or other professionals to follow to try and locate the child, engage the child, etc. There does come a point in the process for long-term missing children where at one of those meetings a formal decision is made to say we have exhausted all local lines of inquiry. So there's no other lines of inquiry that's open to social care, the police or other professionals that we can follow to try and locate the young person. And at that point they become long-term missing. So what that means is that we have a forum which is a 6-weekly meeting, which involves police, health colleagues, home office colleagues, children's services, including the looked after teams and the aftercare service, where information that is held by any one of those professional bodies can be shared. So it's a process that we have strengthened in recent months. It's a process that's been commented on very positively when we've had Ofsted to come and have a look at how we make sure we're safeguarding and working with these young people. It's a process we've had some success from, particularly in terms of information being shared with us by the Home Office. So a young person might have presented to a professional body in another part of the country, for example, and there might be a record on the Home Office file. So what happens is, if there are any kind of information to be shared, the Home Office might have a possible address, for example. It will be shared, and we will identify a practitioner to go out to investigate that address, to call on that young person, to try and make contact with them and to draw them back into Thurrock and kind of understand what's been going on for them, what their current living circumstances are, and encourage them to kind of engage with Thurrock and be supported by us and receive a service, usually from our aftercare service.
Thank you, Chair. Just one more quick question. Apologies, you touched on this in your answer, but you did break up at one or two bits. The report says that all 12 of the missing asylum-seeking children in the April to June chart, the 12 individuals, were between the ages of 16 to 18 years old. What happens if they go missing while they are a child, and then because they're gone for a number of months, that they no longer, they have a birthday and they're no longer considered a child? Does your approach differ then? Do they not? Are they no longer considered an unaccompanied asylum-seeking child? What happens there?
So the approach really doesn't differ. So the case at 18 will be allocated within the aftercare service, and there is one particular senior practitioner within that team that holds all of those missing cases. He would be one of the people who would attend the 6-weekly missing meeting that I was just discussing. And as I said, in our experience, when we have relocated some of our missing young people, they very often are post-18, and so a practitioner from the aftercare service will go out and meet them and help them to understand what the support is that can be provided by the aftercare service and try and re-engage them in that way. So the process really, in terms of monitoring them and being able to kind of offer them a service and make sure they are safeguarded and protected, isn't really affected at the point they turn 18.
Councillor.
Thank you, Chair. And it might be for Janet or Oliver, this question. I'm reading the report. One of the words that jumps out to me is used, they are offered a return to home interview. Offered. Why is it not required? Surely, if we offer someone an interview because they are suffering from some form of abuse in the home that we've put them in, they might not be willing to actually attend that meeting or to have a meeting. Why do we offer it and not require it as a standard procedure?
The return to home interview is a very specific piece of work, and it's offered by a person who is independent of the young person, so they wouldn't necessarily know that person prior to being offered that return to home interview. And there are reasons for that. For example, if they were worried about something their social worker had done or their carer had done, they might be less inclined to have a conversation with somebody who's already part of their support network. So that's a very specific offer in terms of somebody's independent from everybody else who comes in to understand what they're worried about, and like I said, some of those push-pull factors, and make sure we've got a clear understanding of what's going on. Some young people don't want to engage in that process, but what we would make sure of is that there would be a different kind of offer, so that the allocated social worker would, as part of their work with the young person, go out and have a similar conversation and try to understand why the reason for their missing, or what the risks are around their missing, and things like that. So we wouldn't want to compel a young person to meet with somebody they don't particularly know and don't have a previous relationship with and might not want to talk to, but we would make sure that they receive that support in a more familiar way. So there are specific reasons why the return to home offer interview is made, return to home interview is offered, but we accept that some young people won't engage in that process, and therefore we work with those young people in a different way.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Janet.
That's Councillor Rigby, if you want to ask any questions? Has everyone asked all the questions they wish to ask? Okay. Just go through a recommendation that members of the committee note the work of the officers in relation to unaccompanied asylum seeking children presented to Thurrock. Say that's duly noted. Agree?
Agree.
And members are aware of corporate parenting responsibilities extended to your unaccompanied asylum seeking children. Is that agreed? Thank you. But thank you very much indeed, and Janet as well. We appreciate you coming tonight, and also the hard work that you do. We know you do, and we do really appreciate it, especially in such a very difficult area. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, now we'll go on to item 6. But we're going to be the Essex Police Verbal Update, so hopefully that will. Have we got a date? You right?
They haven't come back to me, so.
Okay, well, hopefully they'll come back to us soon. This takes us on to item 7, violence against women and girls, men and boys, verbal discussion with Thurrock. Who will be leading that, please? Is it Rebecca?
Chair, can I say something before we start? It's very difficult to hear you. So I think my colleague probably doesn't know who you all are. I don't know who you all are. I wonder if you could introduce yourself. And I think is it Councillor Anderson nearer the screen? We can hear you. That might be because you're nearer the mic, but it is difficult to hear. So we will do our best.
Whereabouts is the mic?
It's on the.
The laptop.
It's the laptop, so it's me you can hear, Councillor Barrow.
So can I hear you, but it's very difficult to hear anyone else.
Can you see me?
I can see you just about.
Okay.
Got a shout.
All right. Very loudly, I'm Councillor Gary Collins. I'm chair of the Hidden and Extreme Harms Committee. On my right is Councillor Anderson, who is the vice chair. And to my far left is Councillor Shane Ralph, Councillor Ogalada, and Councillor Rigby.
Okay, so if I could introduce ourselves before we start. So I'm Sheila from South Essex Rape and Incest Crisis Centre, and just to give you a bit of background, Thurrock have been providing sexual violence and abuse services in Thurrock for 38 years, and really sometimes it feels like 38 years. So it's quite a long time. And in that time we've seen a lot of change around the issue of sexual violence and abuse, what it means, public awareness of it. And I just would like to highlight for you that Thurrock is often way ahead of other parts of the country in its dealings with sexual violence and abuse. So, Chair, we're here to talk about sexual violence and abuse, not all violence against women and girls, because I don't know about all violence against women and girls. I just know about sexual violence and abuse. So we probably need to be clear, if we're talking about violence, what we're actually talking about. And can I just make one comment? I think Luke's gone, but maybe for Janet. In terms of the report that you've just seen, and I haven't read the report, Janet, I apologise, but it's pertinent to what we're talking about now. Is there anything in the report that talks about boys and men, women and girls? Is there any data about girls and boys, as in unaccompanied asylum seekers? Do you break it down by sex at all? So unless we know in our world who's running away, who's accessing services, what their needs are, if we don't know whether they're boys and girls, we're not going to get this right. So my overarching question is, does the council provide data broken down by boy, girl in terms of unaccompanied asylum seekers?
Sorry, can I come in?
Yep.
Okay.
Is that all right, Chair?
Yes, please.
So yes, we do provide data broken down by male and female. We have very few female unaccompanied asylum seekers. The vast majority are males, and we haven't got any missing girls. They do tend to be boys. But I can provide that data to you if you want it.
No, it's okay. I was just interested in whether or not it happens, because often when we look at reports, things aren't broken down. Often not into ethnicity and not into sex. So it gets difficult to know what you're dealing with unless you do that. So, Chair, if I could hand over to my colleague, we at Thurrock keep all sorts of data. So she would like to share some data with you.
Yeah, just a moment, Sheila. I just want to say as well, you mentioned ethnicity. I was going to mention that as well, because sometimes violence like this can be related also to certain cultures or customs.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Rebecca.
Good evening, everyone. My name's Rebecca, and I deal with the data for Thurrock and for the Essex Rape Crisis Partnership. So just to sort of make you aware, Thurrock are the lead partner in the partnership of 3 rape crisis centres covering the whole of Essex, but I'm today just going to talk to you briefly about Thurrock data only, but we do cover the 14 areas in the whole of Essex and South End Essex and Thurrock. Is that okay? So Michelle, I believe you have my slideshow, and I wondered if we could go to slide 1, please. Excellent. Thank you. And if we could move on to the first slide. So here I've just given you some context around some of the work we do, and to give you some reading sort of backwards into the way we work, where our work comes from. So there is a government strategy on tackling violence against women and girls that was produced in July 2021. And I've also put a link directly to the National Office of Statistics that gives you data in relation to males and females who experience sexual violence and sexual abuse. And as Sheila mentioned, we can't give you information on other types of violence. That might be domestic abuse services, and I'm sure that you have some input from the domestic abuse services, but that's very separate to sexual violence and sexual abuse. So we have put in the definition of rape from Section 1 of the Sexual Offences Act, just to be really clear about the work that we do. So I can read out the definition, which is: a person commits an offence if he intentionally penetrates the vagina, anus or mouth of another person with his penis. The person doesn't consent to that penetration, and the first person doesn't reasonably believe that the person consents. So that's the definition of rape, and that's what we're dealing with at the Thurrock office. So it's very separate, but does cross over with domestic abuse, because sometimes domestic abuse happens in a sexual violence setting within an intimate partnership. So I just wanted to be really clear on the data set that you're going to see. Could I move on to the next slide, please, Michelle? Okay, so in Thurrock, we looked at data between the 1st of April 2020 and the 31st of March 2021. We looked at how many victims and survivors and their families in Thurrock reached out for specialist sexual violence and sexual abuse support, and how old they were. So just to make you aware that we provide services to men, women, boys and girls within our service. So over the period that I mentioned, we worked with 503 individuals that had experienced a sexual offence in Thurrock. They accessed both our specialist counselling services and our independent sexual violence advisor service, and that service provides support through the criminal justice process if that person decides to report that sexual offence to the police. So I've broken down the number of service users accessing our services, and I've put that into male, female and other, for example, non-binary that may access our service. And the pink bars relate to female service users, and the green bars relate to male service users, and the grey bar relates to anybody that identifies as another sex. So our age range of service users ranges, I think our youngest service user at the moment is 4 years old, and our oldest service user is 84 years old. And 67 of our service users were family members or supporters of of their loved ones who had experienced a sexual offence. So, for example, mothers of children, fathers of children who had also been impacted by the sexual violence or sexual abuse that their child had experienced. So it's really important that we support the whole family. Can we move on to the next slide, please, Michelle? Okay, so we looked at how many incidents were disclosed and did those survivors choose to report that offence to the police or not. So for the same period, the 1st of April 2020 to the 31st of March 21, we worked with 122 individuals from Thurrock who had 162 unreported incidents. Those incidents could have taken place at any time in their life, so they could be an adult survivor of childhood sexual abuse, or they could have experienced a recent incident of sexual abuse or sexual violence. We worked with 314 individuals from Thurrock who had reported 318 incidents to the police. And again, I've highlighted the female survivors in the pink bars and the male survivors in the green bars. And if we could move to the next slide, please, Michelle. I know the police aren't here today, but the police kindly provide us a table on when and what time and what day of the week these offences are reported to the police. So in the same time period, Essex Police received 401 reports of sexual violence or sexual abuse. And we can see that from the table, and you may have a chance to have a little look in a little bit more detail later, that our highest recording rate for sexual offences in Thurrock happens on a Thursday between 2 and 3 p.m. So often people think everybody's going to experience an incident at the weekend and report it on Monday morning, but that's not the case from the data from Essex Police. Could we move to the next slide, please, Michelle? So then we looked at who are the perpetrators of rape and sexual abuse in Thurrock. So here we can see I've broken it down into perpetrator type so you can have a little look more clearly. So when the perpetrator was a family member, you can see the green bar are male perpetrators and the pink bars are female perpetrators. And so we can see quite a high rate of parent or adoptive male perpetrators committing these crimes in Thurrock. And again, across to the slide on the right, the perpetrator, when they are a friend or acquaintance, we can see that we have a high level of male perpetrators who are friends and acquaintances from the Thurrock area. Could we have the next slide, please, Michelle? And here we looked at intimate partners. Again, the green bar is a male perpetrator and the pink bar is a female perpetrator. So you can see we have very high levels of intimate partners committing sexual offences against their partners in Thurrock. And again, the slide to the chart to the right, we can see that there were quite a low rate compared to what people might think on stranger attacks compared to the other perpetrator types. So I think when you're looking at the myths and facts around sexual violence, people think, oh, it's the stranger in the alley, but it's actually much more likely to be a male perpetrator within the family home. Could I have the next slide, please, Michelle? And the final slide is just looking at perpetrators who were in a position of trust. And again, I've marked the male perpetrators in a green bar and the female perpetrators in a pink bar. And again, we can see that we have low numbers, but our highest rate of perpetrators in a position of trust are male. And that's the end of my slides. I'm happy to take some questions. If I can't answer your question, I can always come back to you with some data later if that's required.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I ask any questions?
Yeah, I can ask a question. Thank you for the talk. I mean, all this is shocking reading, honestly it is. In comparison to previous years, are we on the rise or are we falling down the numbers?
I think that because of COVID and the lack of people's contact with professionals over the last year, it stayed pretty static between last year and this year. However, we have seen a rise in sexual offences taking place in the home during lockdown, and a reduction in sexual offences taking place outside, because obviously we had the lockdown period. Prior to last year, since 2016, we've seen a steady rise of victims and survivors coming forward. It's quite hard to look at this data because victims and survivors of sexual offences, we know through research, may take up to 10 years to come forward. So we're working with a whole range of people coming forward, people that have experienced something maybe 30 years ago, some that have experienced something last week. So we have a direct referral pathway with Essex Police, and we work very closely with Essex Police and the Eastern Region CPS sexual offences teams. We get lots of referrals directly from police, and work very closely with them, but we also receive multiple referrals from other agencies like health, education, social care, schools, voluntary sector organisations, and our biggest source of referrals are self-referrals.
I think Julie wants to come in on that.
I also sit on, as well as working in Thurrock, I sit on the Silver Command group with government, the COVID Silver Command group that feeds into Gold Command. And Silver Command have collected data weekly and currently fortnightly nationally about sexual violence and abuse. And the data is really interesting. So sexual violence has gone through the roof during COVID. Some for children, but majority for adults. Domestic violence has done the same because I've seen the data, but I haven't seen the breakdown of gender of perpetrator for domestic abuse. But I know we're here to talk about violence against women and girls and violence against men and boys. So maybe this is the point to raise with you, that when we're working with victims and survivors, working with women and girls and men and boys, the experiences that they've suffered are really traumatic, and they can play out with the individual really differently. So it isn't a matter of there's more women and girls experiencing violence or more men and boys. I mean, there actually is more women and girls, but you can't approach providing a service like that. You provide a service to whoever comes to your door wanting help. So women and girls really suffer in dealing with the impacts of sexual violence and abuse, and so do men and boys. It's the same. It's the same as in the suffering and the impact, but it can play out slightly differently. So if I can give you an example, young women often experience child sexual abuse or rape as it's their fault. And we've all heard this. They shouldn't have gone to the club. They shouldn't have had a short skirt on. They shouldn't have travelled alone at night. It becomes their fault. And often in the past, they were slags and whores and they asked for it. That was the myth. The myth with boys and men is they're gay, they wanted it to happen. It plays out differently. And the way it plays out stops victims and survivors talking about it. So where women and girls are frightened about being called liars and slags, men and boys are frightened about being labelled gay or asking for it and not defending themselves. So it's very difficult, but different. So I hope that made sense. I don't know if have any of you got any other questions about the data, or do you want me to talk a little bit more about men and boys? And
my second question. First of all, thank you, Shelley, on that. With experience I have with mental health and teaching mental health, I do come across victims very, very regularly, unfortunately, and I see the impact it has on them, the trauma they suffer, the blame, the lack of confidence, devastating effects on self-esteem it has with them. I totally understand that. It's quite an interesting fact that you spoke about more people that are coming forward now. I did read that Safeline have had a 110% increase on male sexual assault victims coming forward.
Yeah.
Do you feel that more could be done to, I know we do see this advertising of trying to get people to come forward. Do you think more work locally will be on board to do?
Councillor, the Say with Safeline, that's a national contact organisation. So Rape Crisis, we're local, but there is a national rape crisis contact similar to Safeline, and we work quite closely with Safeline. So we work with Neil quite a lot, and their numbers have gone up as well. So nationally, numbers are going up on all the national helplines. Locally, it plays out slightly different in different areas of Essex, but it's pretty much the same. I just would like to share with you, in all my years in working with Thurrock, it's often been said to me from other areas of Essex that anything to do with sexual violence and abuse is higher in Thurrock because we all know what Thurrock's like. Well, actually, that's not the case at all. So when you look at the stats from Brentwood, Colchester, Chelmsford, it's all pretty much the same, but there is still that myth that if you're in a working class area or an urban area, then all this stuff is going to be rife. And it's not the case. Sometimes it comes forward to the authorities quicker in particular areas. It doesn't mean it's not happening anywhere else. So, Councillor, in terms of what we can do, we have at the moment nationally a 10,000 person waiting list for counselling. That includes men and boys and women and girls. Locally, it's about, we're
44.
really good.
44 in
We're
Thurrock.
really good at dealing with our waiting list at Thurrock. So we have 44 and we're quite a small area. Synergy, Essex as a whole, is over 1,000. So doing work to encourage people to come forward is a really important thing to do, and to target that at men and boys and women and girls. But we're terrified that if we get more referrals, we won't be able to cope. We're at capacity. So it's a difficult thing to manage. But yeah, there probably needs to be more information in the media about where you can go and talk. Be happy to talk further with Michelle maybe about how we do that. We also run a thing called Challenging Myths, Changing Attitudes, a training awareness with, and the council have helped us do that. I was discussing it earlier on, and we would like to, if you're in agreement with this, perhaps in the next few months, run a specific session on men and boys. So we always talk about men and boys, and we've had men and boys talking at events. So when we did the Young People's Conference in the council in April, pre-COVID, probably 2019, there were boys present at that. So perhaps that's something we should do, and separate it out, not necessarily try and do it all together. But to share with you, I need to be honest, my experience of talking about men and boys and sexual violence and abuse sometimes is quite difficult. And it's difficult as in when you talk to the community or professionals about men and boys being sexually abused or raped, they care much more about it than they do women and girls. So I've had experience where health people have said to me, come and talk to us about violence against women and girls, which I've done. While I'm sitting there, they then start talking about men and boys. And I said, well, I was here to talk about women and girls, but if you want to talk about men and boys, let's talk about men and boys. And I said, why do you want to change the subject from what you asked me to come and talk about? And then she said, health professional, that it's worse for men and boys. I said, is it? Or is it the same but different? And she said, women have vaginas and that's what they're for. So we have strange attitudes about all this. We, as in a provider in Thurrock, and you as councillors, you're caught in all of this. This is a huge national debate going on all the time in all government departments, lots of local authorities, and we never really get the time between us all to actually sort out what it is we're trying to do and who we're trying to do it for. So I don't know if I answered your question, Councillor, but yeah, we probably need to do some more advertising.
Thank you.
Jen, any other questions? Madison?
Thank you for your report, Rebecca and Sheila. Just very quickly, this is a really quick one, just because on our slides we're talking about rape and sexual violence. Is this including instances of FGM at all? I don't know if that counts as sexual violence.
No, in the government's wisdom, I think the Labour government started this little game a long time ago. FGM is classed as domestic abuse. I do not know why. So we argued quite a lot about that and said actually it's obviously sexual abuse, sexual violence, but no, it's under the domestic abuse stats, which we haven't got.
That's strange.
Could I just add as well that I think the presentation that we saw beforehand around sort of trafficked children, those that don't come to the attention immediately of the authorities, we do work with those, especially those who may have been trafficked for sexual exploitation. So they may come to light, they may come in, be trafficked into the country for sexual exploitation, and they don't come to the attention of the authorities straight away, but as maybe a 17 and 18-year-old, they then reach out for services or do come into contact with services and are referred into. So there may be a crossover there in terms of children that are, or children and young people that are trafficked into the UK for sexual exploitation. Sorry, I just wanted to add that I didn't say earlier.
Oh, thank you for that.
Has that answered your question, Councillor?
It has answered my question, and I have to agree with yourself there. It seems a bit bizarre to me that that's not sexual violence, but there we go. My second question was, and I know this is a really difficult subject, but we have a demographic breakdown here in terms of male, female, perpetrators, victims, etc. Do you have data on other characteristics such as done in groups or a sort of lone wolf, if you like, that sort of data? Because I know in national media people will be aware of grooming gangs that come up, etc. And is this something that you have data on, that you sort of know about locally, if it's going on, if it's not, etc., etc.?
Yes, so sorry, I should have mentioned on slide 4, the first block of slides showed that there were 432 single lone perpetrators that were male, 19 that were female, and then we had 25 incidents that were disclosed, 29 in total that were perpetrated by a group of perpetrators. So they can fall into 2 different categories. So there could be, or quite a few categories. So sometimes there are family members, a group of family members, or a paedophile ring that could constitute a group, or there could be a gang of suspects that attack a person, or there could be somebody that has experienced lots of sexual violence incidents by a group of different people, but singly, but that group are linked somehow. So we do collect data relating to that. And sorry, I should have said on slide 4, it's split between single perpetrators and groups.
Can I also share with you that it's only in recent months that people have got interested in our data. We keep loads of data, but I suppose it's since COVID really that government have been more interested in drilling down into the data, and we're drilling down into it further. So if, Councillor, we're looking at grooming gangs in Thurrock, our data doesn't show that there is. But there is a pattern in some of the perpetrators that would be good for us to look at for another 6 months and maybe come back and tell you what we think that pattern is. So, and whether the pattern fits the myths or not. So most people seem to think that sex offenders are somewhere between 25 and 40. And that's not necessarily the case. And it's the same with victims. Victims somewhere have been between 25 and 35. Well, they're not. I think Rebecca said at the beginning, the oldest victim we worked with in the year of that data was 74, I think you said, Beck.
84.
And, 84. And that's not unusual to work with victims that old. And often victims that old have been sexually assaulted by a health professional. So, the perpetrators for us are as important as the victim. Like, who are the perpetrators in the Thurrock community? Who's doing what? And we probably need to do a little bit more work about drilling down what that is. So we can come back and speak to you more about data if it doesn't bore you to death. I mean, we love data, but, you know, not everyone does.
Yes, please, Sheila.
Yeah, no, final comment from me is I definitely like it noted that, you know, once you've had time to look a little further into this data, I'd certainly like, you know, as long a session as committees, I'm happy to stay all night and talk about it. It's an important issue, and yeah, very happy for you to come back with that.
Can I mean, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to. I'm going to anyway. Can I ask if there's, I have heard, because I've been part of the Violence Against Women and Girls group in Thurrock, where we've worked on the JSNA and the Violence Against Women and Girls strategy. Is there issues about this strategy being called Violence Against Women and Girls? Have you got problems with that you just would like to talk to me about? Happy to discuss it. Don't know if we've got the time.
Yeah. Can I just say this as the chair? Yeah. There was concern that boys weren't getting the same attention or perhaps the level of concern that women and girls were. And it always seemed to be that boys were overlooked. There was always concern that girls were getting preferential treatment as opposed to, say, men and boys. Perhaps one of the reasons why we wanted to say, well, can you just give us more data about the boys and the men? Because we didn't want them losing out, because we know they are coming back.
Can I just jump in as well? Sorry, Sheila, before you come back on that. Certainly from my point of view, I think the issue I detected was that the strategy for men and boys was within a strategy that was just called women and girls. Now, personally, you look at the data and it is much more an issue for women and girls, it would seem, given the data you presented in front of us, this issue, sexual violence. So, you know, certainly I don't think the committee has an issue with looking at data, and the data says that it's more of an issue for women and girls, and therefore perhaps a little more attention is paid there, a little more resource. So that's completely understandable. That's data-driven, you know, solutions or whatever. It was just that the men and boys strategy didn't really seem to be much of a strategy. It was just a sort of maybe a little footnote under the women and girls strategy.
So it's relating back to what I said earlier, you're caught in this big national debate. So there's the Violence Against Women and Girls national strategy, which has just been released. And we're waiting on the men and boys strategy that is part of that. Now, between you and I've said it to government, why we've got men and boys under the heading of violence against women and girls, I really do not know. So I would support the men and boys sector in that. That is ridiculous, but that is the way government have been going for the last 5 years. So I think this year we might get a men and boys strategy as part of the National Violence Against Women and Girls strategy. I mean, what they say is men and boys experience violence against women and girls crimes. Now you can sort of see what that means, but it's not very clear. I think probably by the next refresh, it might be different and there would be 2 separate strategies. It just takes government forever to get it done. Now in Thurrock, there's such little data in terms of sexual violence. As I said, I can't talk about forced marriage, domestic abuse, don't know. There could be something, but it wouldn't be in any way as robust as a full violence against women and girls strategy. If you're talking about 10, 30 individuals compared to 400, it's a difficult thing to manage. But I wouldn't want any of you to think that boys and men don't get a service in Thurrock. They do. And they don't in other areas, but they do in Thurrock.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that we really need. Thurrock's not very good at blowing its own trumpet. So there's things happening in Thurrock around sexual violence and abuse, both for women and girls and men and boys, that aren't happening anywhere else. And we should big it up a bit. And that would also be that men and boys get a service. And when we're talking about victims, we mustn't forget that if we're supporting a victim, if it's a child, that child has parents. That child will have a father often and a mother. So we're supporting mothers and fathers, husbands, brothers. That's all in this too. It isn't just the victim and us. It's the whole family, which includes men and boys as well. When we did the Young Persons Conference in the council in April 2019, that was really powerful hearing from victims themselves. When I talked to the Adult Safeguarding Board, they wanted us to do a similar conference for adults, and then COVID happened. So we are thinking if we go back to the Adult Safeguarding Board and talk about doing a similar conference for victims of sexual violence and abuse, adults, and that would be men and boys and women and girls, we'd do the whole thing. But as I said, COVID has stopped everything. So if we get on with that as we get into the year, we'd hope you'd support us in that, because it's a hidden crime, this.
Yes. Thank you, Sheila. Does anyone else want to ask any questions? No, any follow-ups?
No,
Okay.
I wanted to just say, well done for the work you do. You hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, welcome for the work you do. I was actually so worried to learn that your youngest is 4-year-old, and it's quite worrying for for me, because child they can't come out and say it, but obviously somebody has to detect it. So I hope many people, they get detected and not suffer in silence. But well done for what you do.
Thank you, Bookie. And just to say, in the previous year, our youngest was 3 months old. So the two ends of this are really interesting, like what is going on at the two ends of this. And we need to...
Sorry, we're also having to contend with lots of these crimes are reported to the police, but only 1% of perpetrators are convicted. So out of every 100, we're looking at one person getting a conviction.
Is that a case of the capacities that there in the criminal justice system? Is it a case of the burden of proof is very high? Is it a case of victims not wanting to testify? All of the above?
I think it's all of those things you mentioned, and I think, again, as Sheila mentioned earlier, it's around those myths around sexual violence being perpetrated by people don't believe it happens in the family home, or that children are making it up, or there's a whole range of different reasons why cases don't meet the threshold test to get into a court, and when it does get into a court, it's very low, and that's nationally across the country. And I think we've come from a place where it was much lower and a victim and survivor's experience was much worse in a court. I think that we're moving towards making things a little bit easier for victims and survivors with the new Victims Code, with the 12 rights that have recently been published. So I think it's really important that all of our agencies are aware of the Victims Code and what those victims' rights are that they didn't have enshrined previously. But I think more and more support is out there. But like I said, there's a whole range of reasons for those offences not going through the criminal justice system and victims not getting justice.
We've been talking to the Thurrock Police and Essex Police about some sort of media, social media, real out there stuff as we come out of COVID. But what we've agreed is we need to start giving messages to perpetrators. We all talk about victims all the time, and rightly so, and we can never talk about victims enough. But all the messaging is always for victims. It's never for the perpetrator. And I think, Michelle, I don't know when it was, God knows how many years ago, the Community Safety Partnership released a poster that went on all buses, and there was a guy in a cell behind bars, and it said, "You commit domestic abuse, you will end up in jail," type comment. Not true, however, but a good poster. But we're trying to work with Thurrock Police about how to produce some posters that are messages for perpetrators, i.e. no more telling boys and girls and men and women not to do this, not to do that, not to wear this, not to go there, but to tell perpetrators to stop doing it, because that's the bit that doesn't happen.
quite agree. Can I ask a question of both of you, please? You mentioned that some of the abuse has been carried out by health professionals. Do we have any figures on that in Thurrock and any figures on that nationally? I've heard it's only by chance that you might see a doctor so-and-so has been struck off for sexual misconduct. We need to know how rife it is, one in Thurrock and also nationally too.
So on slide 8, we have perpetrator type, person in a position of trust, and that's a whole range of people in a position of trust. So that ranges from work colleagues, member of a faith group, foster carers, doctors, police officers. So we have a whole range of people in a position of trust that may commit sexual crime, and I think probably looking back to the Jimmy Savile case, we saw that perpetrator had built himself into that position of trust, so nobody questioned him. So as I said, there are some stats for Thurrock on that slide 8. Nationally, we can have a look a little bit more, but yeah, I can try and find out some data for you nationally, but on slide 8 are the ones for Thurrock.
If you're interested
in the last financial year.
If you're interested in the specifics, councillor, I think and I've been around long enough to know this. I'm not sure anyone else who's been around this long in Thurrock, but when I think it was in the late 80s, there was a doctor, a GP, who had sexually assaulted 63 patients in Thurrock, and it hit the headlines, and it was quite a big case. So we were involved in that. So every now and again, there is a something. We haven't had a something for a few years, but I can think of maybe 3 high-profile national cases involving health professionals who were sexually assaulting patients in Thurrock over the years. So obviously, if anything like that came to light, we'd know it. We see the pattern instantly in the data because the same name comes up as the doctor. But we would obviously share that with the police and we would deal with that. But currently, councillor, there is no particular pattern around anything like that. But there is a pattern for professionals sexually assaulting their students, their patients, their congregation. There is a pattern of that, and there would be because they're in a position of power.
Okay, and you did at least to an extent give me a little bit of respite from a worry that there aren't currently, as far as you know, any grooming gangs operating in Thurrock at the moment. But we really would like to have a look at the data, or after you drill down into the data, to see if there are patterns emerging. We're very close to London these days, and big cities always seem to attract the wrong sort of people and then branch out into areas outside.
So we do have some gangs operating in the Basildon area with young people travelling out of Thurrock into Basildon and back, and Romford and back. So that may come up in some of the children's services missing data. So we're currently working with 2 young people that are travelling in and out of Basildon and Romford, and often we see young people coming in from Ilford, places like that, but we can certainly talk to you about that a little bit more.
Please, are these grooming gangs?
I think maybe 1 or 2 might be grooming gangs, but I think the data around Operation Goldcrest that's operating in Thurrock will give you a full picture of the grooming gangs that are operating in Thurrock. So Operation Goldcrest is a police-run operation that's only operates in Thurrock at present, where young people who are involved in grooming gangs are able to have forensics taken and give intelligence to police on other types of crimes that these grooming gangs may be committing. And then the police are putting in disruption tactics to arrest those perpetrators for other offences, to take them off the streets, to get them away from these young people that they're sexually exploiting. So I'm not sure who's responsible for Operation Goldcrest in the Thurrock area. I'm not sure. Do you know anything about it, Michelle? I know that the officer was Caroline Williams, but I know she's since retired. I'm not sure who's taken over.
It's through the local Safeguarding Children's Partnership that's monitored, and the project's fed back onto them.
So they would be able to give you a real good flavour of what's going on with grooming gangs in Thurrock.
Could we arrange to meet a representative, please, Michelle, at our next meeting? No?
You're on mute.
You're on mute, Michelle.
Yeah, it's the Safeguarding Children's Partnership, so the request would have to come through them, not the Community Safety Partnership, although obviously we're aware of it. It's through the Children's Services. They lead on that project. Can I just give you some reassurance around the gangs? One of the places, obviously, that would attract this sort is hotels. So we have what's called Operation Make Safe. That was launched probably about 4 years ago by the police, and a lot of work went on with the hotels, and they follow it up with they use the cadets to go in and actually do test purchase type visits. So obviously last couple of years with COVID, hotels haven't been open, that hadn't been any awareness raising there. So what we've just done at the moment, last month, every single hotel in Thurrock received a letter signed by the district commander advising them with information and advice, and sharing a poster for them all to put up again. The next thing, through the Safeguarding Children's Partnership, they're revamping their website and putting a webinar of training on that's going to be shared with all hotels for their staff to watch, or online and do this training. And then we've just agreed with the police, the cadets will then go out and do a follow-up test purchase operation with those hotels, again, to check their knowledge and understanding. So that's sort of how the process and rigour we're putting in place to raise awareness with venues that are potentially going to be used by people to exploit. The gangs would use them to exploit. Does that make sense?
And could I add, Michelle, probably about 3% of the service users that we see might be involved in gangs or grooming and experience sexual violence. As a result of that, we'd see a much larger, huger volume of children and young people that are actually abused in the home by a family member. That's the most prevalent in Thurrock.
You going to say something, Sheila?
Yeah, just fine. I could go on forever now. I'm really enjoying myself.
Well, listening to you.
So, Chair, we're happy to come back and speak to you again. If there's issues about violence against women and girls, and in our world, sexual violence, then it's important to talk about it. So I welcome this opportunity to discuss it. When you talk about it with people, you get a better understanding. So you'll understand where we're coming from, and we'll understand where you're coming from. If we don't talk, we won't do that. But the final contentious thing, and I think it happened after Sarah Everard, after the Sarah Everard, which we refer to as a sexual murder, because that's what it was. So we don't usually call murders like that sexual murders, but that was a sexual murder. They always nearly are, and we don't refer to it properly. And soon after that, women contacted the Home Office. I think there was something like 80,000. I'm terrible with numbers.
It was 83,000.
So 83,000 women and some men contacted the Home Office about their feelings about that murder and violence against women and girls generally. And from that came the phrase male violence against women and girls. Now, I've said male violence against women and girls at some places, some meetings over the last few months, and some people really hate it. So I just need to share with you, this isn't blaming men. All men do not commit violence against women and girls. But the violence against women and girls that is committed is primarily men. And we can't hide from that. It's a fact. And if we don't face it and be brave about it, we will never stop this thing. And we need to do that together as women and men. We can't do it separately. I finished.
That's all right. We appreciate where you're coming from. Thank you very much. And it's not that we have a problem with violence against women and girls organisations as such. It's a terrible thing. Rape is a terrible thing. Our concern was that maybe the boys and men were not getting the same attention. You reassured us of that. But I quite agree with you that with your point of view about the strategy, they should be separate because the way they deal with it is different.
Yeah, yes, it's different.
Yeah, and I'd also like to say thank you for the support that you give to the families, because when somebody you love gets raped, it's the whole family that's violated. It's a terrible, terrible crime.
One of the worst things, Councillor, I dealt with was a daughter who had been raped by a health professional, and it went to court. He got off. Then the family and the victim took it to a private civil court, and she won. Then he appealed. Then she lost. Then they took it back, and she won. And by the third time this had gone through the process, the father had a heart attack and died. He couldn't stand it anymore. So watching that happen was just awful. I've never forgotten it. He couldn't cope. He just wanted to kill the guy. That's all he wanted to do, and he couldn't do anything. Just had to watch it all play out. But anyway, other than that, victims do get over it and they're okay.
Okay, thank you. Can I just ask the committee here, do you have any more questions or points you wish to make? No. Okay. So just to conclude the business we have, I've lost which page I'm on. I do apologise.
You need to go back to the front. Were there any recommendations?
I'll just check.
There's no recommendations.
No?
Chair.
Okay. There's no recommendations, so thank you very much indeed for coming tonight and talking to us. And yes, we would like you to come back and go through after you've done the mining of the data and give us your wisdom on the trends that are showing from that data, please. Are you all happy with that? Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed for your time. And,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
And last item.
We're going now. Is that okay?
Yeah, bye, Sheila.
Bye bye.
See you again soon. Bye. Thank you, everyone. Okay, the last item, item 8, work programme. Are the items that we wish to add, because we'll be having Sheila coming back with data.
That's on the work programme for the new municipal year.
Yeah. That's it.
We had one more meeting, this we've already.
17th February, isn't it?
17th February. But she said in 6 months she'll have the update on the data.
Yeah.
She'll come back in 6 months.
Sorry, Cheryl.
Thank you, Chair. Could we have some clarity, please, around the reports that you're requiring, just so that we can manage expectations? So, the report on hate crime and social media, I didn't quite hear what was discussed earlier, but are you attending CGS, Chair, or are we bringing that to this meeting in February, or what's happening?
There's a meeting, or there's a CGS presentation on this on 20th.
Yeah, 20th. That's Michelle Cunningham's report, so she might be able to give a bit more clarity on that. But I don't know if do you want to explain to the chair, Michelle?
Yeah, it is covered within the overarching CSP report, but I know you're interested in maybe a deeper dive of hate crime. So I have drafted a full report on hate crime for you. What I've done, looking at terms of reference for this meeting, I've linked it into how the concerns nationally around the prevent agenda and hate crime agenda. It doesn't really include social media, and I explain in the report why, because the data just simply isn't there about it. And whilst we know it's a major concern, you know, not just in Thurrock but everywhere, actually, because of the nature of how hate crime plays out on social media, it's very difficult to know where the perpetrators are and where the reporting is. So what I've done is just focused on how we deal with it. and within the refresh for the Essex-wide strategic strategy that's undergoing at the moment, obviously one of the things in there for them to look at again is online, so it's not just about how Thurrock respond to it, it's a much wider Essex Police issue and Essex Partners issue, but we all know as well that some of the social media companies do not take really the care and attention we would want them to do over this and take a robust approach to it. But I have covered that within a report. I'm just not sure if it's what you really wanted from this meeting.
That's the one for 17th of February, is that correct?
It is, yes.
Okay, so we'll do the 17th of February one unless anyone wants to go to the...
Yeah, we'll do 17th of February.
17th of February, okay, thank you very much. And just take me off the 20th price.
Yeah.
I'll wait for the report. Thank you very much.
Could we also, sorry, Chair, could we also have some clarity around the other report in relation to violence against men and boys? I'm not sure, after what you've heard tonight from Sheila, if that's still required, or shall we perhaps do something, in combination with Sheila when she comes back to this group again? I think you said in about 6 months' time, did you?
Does anyone want to say
Yeah,
we wouldn't burn anymore. That's fine. We'll move back to 6 months' time.
That means we've got a very light programme next month, Jim.
Sorry?
Means we've got a very light agenda.
Yeah.
Anything you want to add?
So there's some update.
Certainly. We've got an unaccompanied child asylum seekers. We've done that really already. So we'll take the unaccompanied child asylum and terrorism update.
Police updates.
Yeah, well, that's right. We need the police update as well.
That's so good about the magic.
So the police aren't able to attend the 17th February either, and I'm still waiting for them to provide me with a date of when they can come, so we can arrange another meeting.
Could we anyone from the local community policing team attend?
I'm not sure. I think that's something for Michelle to say, because I don't know which police it will be. But I'm trying to arrange the one that's from this report, which is the
So
Essex
Michelle,
Police.
I was just saying, if we've got anyone from the local community policing team that could attend.
I think the question was, you wanted them to talk about organised immigration crime, didn't you?
Yeah.
So that's, how Essex Police is structured. There's so many different teams and departments, and that comes under a different command than the district commander, who's responsible for the local response in Thurrock around community policing. So whilst he has a knowledge, he clearly doesn't have the same level and in-depth awareness of this issue as Chief Superintendent Hooper, who was due to be the person leading on this. He was the force lead for Operation Melrose, the tragic events that happened in West Thurrock in 2019. So that's why he was coming to talk through on the back of that, all the changes that they'd brought in, not just in Thurrock, but it was about that response, to talk to you about that. And really, he is the person that has led throughout the whole of that, that I thought and understood was what you wanted to hear from and be updated on. Correct me if I'm wrong there. But he is in the middle of changing roles as well, which is why it's difficult for him to. He did commit to the December meeting and would have been here.
Yeah. Okay. We might have to fit him in then when whoever can come. So
Janet's got a hand up as well.
Sorry, Janet.
That's okay. I just wanted to clarify about UASC. I understood there was an item for UASC on the agenda. Is that still the case? I'm just thinking, as we've spoken about it today, what you would want if you were wanting a report.
Ready.
The chair said that we've taken that one off.
Okay, all right, thank you.
I can hear it. No one's ever accused me of having a quiet.
Yeah, next week we've only got 8.
We've got modern day slavery, human trafficking update report. Is that right?
That's on there.
Yeah, that'll be on there, will it?
Yeah. We've asked for terrorism update.
Yeah.
And then we asked
says
for
on
hate
Thurrock.
crime and social media.
I'm not sure if officers were going to do the terrorism update in time because it's a month to the next meeting and there's report deadline to meet, which is in the next 3 weeks. Michelle, the
Doesn't
chair,
have weekly, so you should be able to do.
the committee's asked for an update on the terrorism, for a terrorism update. Would officers be able to meet the report deadlines in time for 17th February?
What I would say in terrorism, because you've had an update at the first meeting in October around that, and there is a prevent report due to overview and scrutiny in 3rd of February, is it? I know it's written. So that report is done, but it would be the same report that's going to overview and scrutiny, and it isn't that dissimilar to the report that came here in October. You said about the modern day slavery and human trafficking. I think Fran's down to lead on that, isn't she?
Right.
She actually leaves the authority at the end of this month. So following on from the discussions at the last meeting, and I think we were in absolute agreement with you around the confusion that it was sitting under our Violence Against Women and Girls Action Plan and strategy. So we are in the process of pulling that out. It links very much into a piece of wider work that's been done on the guidance across the set authorities, so Southend, Essex and Thurrock. And so that guidance has just been revised and I believe was signed off before Christmas, but I haven't had confirmation of that. And so we're putting in place a localised plan for that. It is drafted, but it is not and won't be in a position for the next meeting, I'm afraid, to go public because it won't have been through the Community Safety Partnership Board. So whilst I can talk to you about what we're doing, I won't be able to bring that plan to this to next committee until a new municipal year once it's been signed off by the Community Safety Partnership.
Okay. So, what about smuggling of body parts? Does that all come under human trafficking? I understand this goes on. Is that correct? Have we got a report?
Organ harvesting?
Yeah.
Yeah, thankfully I don't have any reports of that or awareness, but it is included as a one of the headlines that organ harvesting is part of modern day slavery. But yeah, not as we are aware of any reports for Thurrock.
Okay.
So I just want to clear,
Which is quite light.
we can't get no police.
No police.
No police.
Yeah. We've got hate crime and social media, league on social media. We've got terrorism update, which we can't have because it's not up to date yet. And modern day slavery and human trafficking update report. Could we actually include what goes on with organ harvesting and that sort of stuff? A little more information on that report by Fran. We asked her nicely.
Just a minute, I can tell you what it says in relation to it probably. If you bear with me. It's in there, but there is nothing because there is no information on it, if that makes sense.
Chair, can I suggest that we have a think about this over the next few days?
Yeah, I'm going to say we don't make a decision tonight. Give us to the end of the week, and we'll have a couple of other bits as while we have a ponder. Okay.
Okay, Chair, but it will depend on the report deadlines as well, whether officers can get them turned around in time, because it needs to go through legal implications and financial and diversity as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's just officers tonight have really cut our options of what we can bring in.
If there's certain items the committee wants quite urgently on the agenda, because this committee was formed halfway through the municipal year, so these meeting dates weren't actually agreed at full council. We are in a position where we could change the committee date, the next meeting, if there's availability for that, for that meeting to take place. Sorry?
I think that's late March.
Yeah, late March.
Okay. If we could get it in before then.
Yeah, it would depend on availability, but that is an option there. So it would depend on what kind of reports that the committee wants to see.
One of the things we spoke about before was about teenagers being dragged into drug gangs. And that, but I don't know where that will fall in, who'll be responsible for that. I'm guessing it's going to be policing it.
I wouldn't know. I think probably Michelle would know. Yeah.
Apologies, I couldn't hear that.
If we're supposed to report on teenagers being moved into drug gangs, would that be a police report or an officer's report?
We brought a gangs report, didn't we, to the first meeting?
Yeah, is there anything more specific? Because obviously the first meeting, those 4 reports were sort of general introductory reports to the 4 issues set out in the terms of reference. So I don't know if Councillor Ralph has anything in particular that you want to drill down into with regard to criminal gangs or that you...
Yeah, I'm just aware that obviously we, in connection with the local police at the moment, we are aware of certain things that are happening in the area. At the same time, I'm also aware that this video is eventually uploaded, and so I'll be wary of what information could have to be presented to the committee. So I don't know about ongoing operations.
We can have pink papers and go into exec for those kinds of issues.
Yeah, I think that would be nice if we could have some update of the ongoing issues that the police are currently working on, so we can work out what we can do with education processes with schools, or what information we can do. As before, we used to do the wanted cards for the terrorism alert stuff and all that. If we can work out more what the cards of what to expect if your child's getting involved in drug gangs, you know, is he coming over with nice shirts and all that sort of stuff.
So when we brought the paper before, the one thing that I know was included and was an appendix was the parent gang leaflet. So I think that covers all of that. So that's been distributed. It's there. I've just ordered another 2,000 of them. Actually, they're sitting in the police station ready to go out to an event in Grays in a couple of weeks during half term. So that's in place, that parent gang leaflet. I think if you give a clear steer on what it is you would like to know around gangs and drugs, etc., then we can approach the police and ask for the appropriate officer to come and talk to you about it. I'm not sure they'd write a report, but you know, like you've just had with Thurrock, if that would be helpful.
That might. I'll tell you what, give us till Friday. Everyone on the committee can email me the things they'd like to see in the work programme. We'll choose one and see if Ben can help us.
Otherwise, it's a bit fishing at the moment.
Yeah, otherwise, yeah. And this is a long time when I start sort of racking our brains. So unless there's anything else, so give us a call by Friday what you'd like to see, the one marked item, and I'll pass this on to Michelle and we'll have a look. Okay? Yeah. So I'll end at what do you call 20 to 9. Okay? Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone. Bye.
Bye, Janet.
Bye everyone.
Bye, Michelle.
Thank you.
Bye.
Carol.